Story 1. This happened about 3 years ago, and I still don't have an explanation for what I saw. Sometimes I convince myself it was exhaustion, or just my imagination. But there's a part of me that knows it wasn't. It was too real. The smell, the sounds, the way the air felt heavy, almost wet with something that wasn't rain. I had taken a job helping out on an old family farm belonging to my uncle, just outside a small town in the countryside. He was getting older, and I thought spending a summer there would do me good. Fresh air, quiet nights, a little bit of solitude. The place was huge, about 50 acres of open land surrounded by forest, with a red barn that looked like it hadn't been repainted since the 80s. The first few weeks were uneventful. My routine was simple. Wake up before sunrise, feed the animals, mend fences, help with planting. I slept in a small guest room above the main house where the wooden floor creaked every time I shifted in bed. At night, the only sounds came from the crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the distant hum of the windmill turning near the field. Peaceful, almost comforting. Then came the nights when I couldn't sleep. It started with the animals. Around midnight, they'd get restless, especially the cows. I'd hear them moving around, low groans echoing through the dark. When I went to check, they'd be bunched together at the far end of the pen, eyes fixed toward the edge of the woods. Every time, same direction. Always that same uneasy stillness, like they were waiting for something to move back. I tried asking my uncle about it. He just shook his head, said animals spook easy when the weather's about to change. But there was no storm, no wind, no reason for them to behave like that. I noticed their feed started to go untouched some mornings. One night, I found a patch of soil near the pen dug up, not by tools but by hand. The prints were deep, almost claw-like, though I couldn't tell if they were animal or human. The smell came a few days later. It wasn't the usual farm stench. This was worse, thick and sour, like rotting meat. It drifted in from the cornfield just after sunset. I thought maybe something had died out there, so I grabbed a flashlight and went to check. The stalks were tall that summer, brushing my shoulders as I pushed through, the light bouncing off them like thin golden walls. The deeper I went, the more I could smell it, so strong it made my eyes water. Then I saw the clearing. Something had flattened a section of the crops, leaving a perfect circle in the middle of the field. In the center was a small pile of feathers and bones, all arranged carefully, like a nest or some kind of offering. My stomach turned. I backed away and ran straight to the house. My uncle wouldn't come out to see it. He just told me to stay away from that part of the field for a while. When I asked him what he thought it was, he only said, "Not everything on a farm belongs to us." Then he shut his door and didn't come out for the rest of the night. That was when I started hearing footsteps outside my window. The first night I heard them, I thought it was my uncle. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, crunching softly over the gravel outside my window. I waited for him to call my name, but he never did. When I looked out, the yard was empty, the moonlight stretching over the barn and fields. I went back to bed, telling myself it was probably one of the dogs. But they weren't barking. They were completely silent. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same pacing. This time, the footsteps went past my window and stopped by the barn. I heard the latch creak. Then nothing. When I told my uncle in the morning, his face went pale. He didn't say much, only muttered something about not feeding it attention. I pressed him for an explanation, but he changed the subject, telling me to keep the doors locked after dark. By now, the animals refused to go near the barn at all. Even during the day, they stayed clustered close to the house. The horses would pull back on their reins when I tried leading them there, snorting and trembling until I gave up. I started feeding them farther out near the pasture instead. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from inside that barn whenever I walked past it. One afternoon, while my uncle was in town, I finally decided to look inside. The air inside was damp, heavy with the smell of soil and something metallic. Dust floated in the light, cutting through the gaps in the wood. Everything looked normal. Stacks of hay, tools hanging on the wall, a few empty crates. But the ground near the back was darker, almost wet. When I crouched down, I realized it wasn't water. It was darker than that. I followed the trail to a loose board in the floor. It came up easily. Beneath it was a small hollow, like a pit, maybe 3 feet deep. Inside were bones, animal bones mostly, though some were too long, too thin to be from anything I recognized. There were tufts of hair, pieces of fabric, even what looked like a button from a shirt. My stomach turned cold. I covered it back up and didn't tell my uncle. I don't know why. Maybe part of me didn't want to hear his explanation. Or maybe I already sensed that he wouldn't be surprised. That night, I woke up to the smell again, stronger than ever. It filled the room thick and rancid, like it was seeping through the walls. My flashlight barely worked. The beam kept flickering. When I stepped into the hall, I saw my uncle's door wide open, his bed empty. His boots were gone too. I grabbed my jacket and ran outside, calling for him. My voice felt small against the open fields. The smell led me back toward the barn. The door was wide open, swinging slightly. The dogs were nowhere to be seen. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat as I stepped closer. The light from my flashlight caught something on the ground just outside the door. Footprints, bare ones, deep, heavy, pressed into the mud. They led inside. I should have turned back. I should have waited until morning, but I didn't. Inside the barn, it was almost completely dark, except for the thin silver light leaking through the slats. The smell was overpowering now, thick and sharp enough to sting my nose. My hands were trembling as I aimed the flashlight forward. Its weak beam swept over the hay bales, the old ladder, the tools hanging on the wall, then landed on something in the corner. It was my uncle's hat, half buried in the dirt. Beside it, the floorboard I had lifted earlier was gone, pulled completely aside. The hole beneath it was wider now, as if someone or something had been digging. I could hear my breathing echoing in the still air, shallow and uneven. No, the dirt inside that pit wasn't still. It looked like it had been recently disturbed, shifting slightly as though something had moved beneath it. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in place. I wanted to call out, but no sound came. I don't know how long I stood there staring, but when I finally took a step back, my foot brushed against something soft. I turned and saw a small bundle near the door, one of the feed sacks, torn open. Inside it wasn't grain, it was hair, clumps of dark, tangled hair, mixed with what looked like bits of skin. I dropped the flashlight. For a few seconds, everything went black. When I picked it up again, the beam caught something standing at the far end of the barn. I couldn't make out its face, but I could see the outline, tall, thin, its arms hanging too low, almost reaching the ground. It was swaying, just slightly, like it was breathing. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My chest felt tight, and my throat burned as I tried to breathe. The thing didn't move toward me. It just stood there, the light trembling across its outline. Then, slowly, it tilted its head. I could feel it watching me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. When I finally managed to move, I ran out through the field, all the way to the truck parked by the fence. I didn't look back until I was on the road. From there, I could see the barn, barely visible in the distance. The door was swinging again, wider this time, and just before I lost sight of it, I swear I saw a figure step out and stand in the moonlight. The police searched the next morning. They found the hole, the bones, and my uncle's hat, but not him. They said animals probably dragged the remains there, though they couldn't explain the footprints or the circle in the cornfield. The farm was sold a few months later. I haven't been back since. Sometimes, when I drive through the countryside at night, I still catch the faint scent of that same rotting air through the open window. It's never strong, just enough to make me remember that place, the barn, and the thing that was waiting inside it. And every time I wonder if it ever really stayed there, or if it followed me home. Story 2. This happened 5 summers ago, but I still think about it every night before I sleep. Sometimes I wake up sweating, my heart pounding like it did that night, and I can still smell the dirt and the rain. I tell myself it was just exhaustion, that I imagined everything. But deep down, I know I didn't. My uncle's farm was the kind of place that felt like time forgot it. Miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by miles of dry fields and whispering corn. I'd gone there to help for a few weeks after college, some quiet, hard work to clear my head. He lived alone after my aunt passed, and though the place was old and a little run down, it had a strange kind of calm. During the day, anyway. At night, it was different. The silence there wasn't peaceful. It was thick, heavy, like the whole world stopped breathing once the sun went down. Even the crickets would go quiet sometimes, and I'd find myself lying awake in that old, creaky guest room, listening to the house settle, the beams groaning softly above me. The first strange thing I noticed was how the animals behaved. The cows, usually slow and gentle, would all turn toward the woods at dusk, standing still, their ears twitching. They wouldn't graze until sunrise. I'd try to lead them back into the barn, but they resisted, snorting and pulling away. My uncle told me to let them be. "Animals feel things we don't," he said, lighting his cigarette with shaking hands. Then, the smell came. It drifted through the yard around midnight, sour, damp, like wet soil mixed with rot. It wasn't strong at first, but it clung to the air. I thought maybe something had died near the cornfield. So I went out with a flashlight. The beam cut through the mist, catching the tops of the corn, the old windmill, the fence line. Everything looked the same. Except for one thing, the scarecrow. It was leaning forward that night. I hadn't noticed it before, but it was definitely tilted, like it was about to fall. Its hat was missing, its burlap face half torn, one arm hanging lower than the other. I assumed the wind did it. I straightened it up, fixed the hat I found on the ground, and went back inside. But the next morning, it was gone. Not knocked down, gone. The pole still stood there, empty, the string and old shirt it wore lying in the dirt. I told my uncle, but he just stared at the field for a long moment, then said quietly, "It happens sometimes." That was all. That night, the smell came back, stronger. The animals were restless again, and I couldn't sleep. I tried to ignore it, but around 2 in the morning, I heard something in the field. Slow, heavy footsteps dragging through the soil. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The sound stopped near my window, then started again, heading toward the barn. When I finally looked outside, I saw movement by the cornfield. Something tall, almost human-shaped, standing where the scarecrow used to be. But it wasn't still, it was swaying, like it was breathing. I didn't sleep at all that night. By sunrise, I'd convinced myself it had to be a trick of the fog, maybe even a stray animal that wandered in from the woods. But when I went out to the field, there were footprints, bare ones, pressed deep into the dirt between the rows of corn. Too big to be mine, too defined to be from boots. They started near the fence, and led straight to the spot where the scarecrow had been. After that, they just stopped, as if whoever, or whatever it was, had sunk into the ground. I didn't tell my uncle about the footprints. He was quieter than usual that morning, sipping his coffee and staring at the window like he was waiting for something to happen. When I asked if he'd gone out during the night, he just shook his head and said, "Best not to look too hard at things out here." The rest of the day was heavy, like the air itself didn't want to move. Even the windmill stayed still. I tried to focus on my chores, feeding the chickens, fixing the fence, but every time I looked toward the field, I had that crawling feeling along my neck, the sense of being watched. That night, I kept the lights on. I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window staring at the field, the rows stretching into the dark like narrow tunnels. Hours passed. Around midnight, the house started to creak again, long and slow, like something shifting inside the walls. The air felt colder, even though it was still summer. I could see my breath. Then the smell returned, thick and close this time, like it was seeping from the wood itself. My throat tightened, and my heart started racing. I told myself to stay put, but I couldn't. Something in me needed to see, needed to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside. The yard was silent. No crickets, no wind, nothing. My boots sank into the dirt as I walked toward the barn, every step louder than it should have been. The smell was stronger out there, coming from the direction of the field. I turned the beam toward it and froze. There was a shape standing by the fence line again. Tall, still, just like before. My light caught what looked like the same torn shirt, the same burlap hanging loose where the face should have been. But now the head was tilted toward me as if it was watching. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My chest felt tight, and my breathing came out in short bursts. Then, slowly, it began to turn. Not the way a person would. More like something twisting from the inside. That's when I realized it wasn't standing on the pole anymore. I took a step back, but the ground behind me felt unsteady, like it was softer than it should have been. My flashlight shook in my hand, the beam bouncing across the field. When it passed over the figure again, it was closer, maybe 10, 15 feet from the fence now. The torn fabric on its arms moved slightly, though there was no wind. I couldn't make out a face anymore, just a dark hollow where the burlap had ripped away. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Every part of me screamed to run, but my body wouldn't listen. I stood there, staring at that thing until the flashlight began to dim. The battery was dying. The beam flickered weakly over the field one last time, and the figure was gone. The smell still hung in the air, stronger now. I turned and sprinted for the house, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My uncle's room was empty. His boots were gone. I called his name again and again, but the only sound was the windmill starting to turn outside for the first time in days. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, listening, trying to steady my breathing. It must have been hours before I heard the front door open. Slow, steady steps came across the porch. I felt the weight of each one through the floorboards. When the footsteps stopped outside my room, I couldn't breathe at all. The door creaked a little, and I saw a shadow stretch across the hall. I whispered my uncle's name. No answer, just silence. Then after a few seconds, the shadow moved away. The steps went back across the porch, then faded toward the barn. I stayed there until morning. When the sun came up, I finally forced myself outside. The field looked normal again. No footprints, no figure, nothing out of place. But near the fence, I saw something that made my stomach turn. My uncle's hat was hanging on the scarecrow's pole. The same torn shirt was back on it, tied neatly as if it had never been disturbed. I tried calling him all day, but he never came back. I packed my things that evening and left before the sun went down. A few weeks later, I got a call from a local sheriff. They found the farm abandoned. The animals were gone, and the barn door was open. The only thing left standing in the field was the scarecrow, with a new face stitched from burlap, a cigarette tucked neatly into its shirt pocket. Sometimes, when I drive through rural roads late at night, I'll see fields out the window, rows of corn under the moonlight. I can't help but glance toward the scarecrows that stand in them, just to make sure they aren't leaning too far forward. Because every time one of them is, I get that same feeling. The smell, the cold air, and the thought that maybe it followed me after all. Story 3. I wasn't drunk, I wasn't dreaming, and I wasn't trying to scare myself. It was just a quiet night on my cousin's farm, and somehow it became the night that's haunted me ever since. The farm was tucked deep in the countryside, surrounded by miles of open fields. No neighbors, no streetlights, just acres of land and silence so thick you could hear your own pulse when the wind stopped. My cousin, Eli, had been running it alone since his father passed, and I'd offered to help out for a few weeks. He was grateful for the company, said things had been strange lately, but wouldn't go into detail. During the day, everything seemed normal. We fed the animals, fixed the fences, hauled hay to the barn. I liked the simplicity of it, but when night came, the farm changed. The air got heavier, colder, like the ground itself was holding its breath. The lights inside the house would flicker every now and then, and the floorboards groaned even when no one was walking. I chalked it up to old wiring and settling wood, but Eli's face always tightened when it happened. One evening, I was out late in the field checking on the irrigation lines. The sun had just dropped behind the hills, and that dull orange glow was fading fast. The only sound was the soft hum of insects and the distant creak of the windmill. Then, out of nowhere, every animal went silent. The crickets, the cows, even the frogs by the pond. Nothing. The silence hit so suddenly that I actually stopped walking. I remember feeling a strange pressure in my chest, like the air had thickened. The windmill slowed to a stop. I looked toward the barn, and that's when I noticed the door was open. Just slightly, but I knew we'd locked it earlier. The chain hung loose, swaying back and forth like it had been forced open. When I got closer, I saw that the padlock was still hooked but bent out of shape. The metal twisted. I shone my flashlight inside, but the beam only reached the first few feet. Just hay, a few tools, nothing unusual. Still, my heart was racing. I could feel it hammering against my ribs as I took another step forward. There was a faint sound from the back of the barn, something brushing against the floor. I froze. The smell hit next, like old dirt and something metallic, faint but sharp enough to make me gag. I whispered Eli's name, even though I knew he was still inside the house. When I turned to leave, I saw a movement at the edge of the field. A figure. It was standing near the fence just far enough that I couldn't make out its face. It wasn't moving, just standing, watching. I ran straight back to the house, my flashlight beam shaking so badly it barely lit the ground. When I got inside, Eli was sitting at the kitchen table, staring out the window toward the field. Before I could say anything, he said, "You saw it too, didn't you?" I didn't answer right away. My chest was tight, and my throat felt dry. Eli didn't look surprised, just tired, like he'd been expecting it. He told me to sit down and said, "If you see it once, it'll come back." I wanted to believe he was joking, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't. His hands were trembling slightly as he lit a cigarette. I asked what he meant, but he wouldn't explain, only said to stay inside after dark and never go near the barn at night again. The next few days passed in uneasy silence. Nothing happened during the daylight. The animals acted normal. The air felt calm again. And I started to convince myself I'd imagined that figure. Maybe it was just a trick of the fading light. Or maybe a stray animal had wandered close to the fence. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every night, I'd hear faint creaks in the hallway outside my room. I told myself it was the house settling. But sometimes I'd wake up with the distinct sense that someone was standing near my door. That kind of feeling you can't prove, but you know is real. On the fifth night, I woke up to the sound of the barn door slamming shut in the distance. I thought maybe the wind had caught it, so I went to Eli's room to tell him. But his bed was empty. The window was open, the curtain blowing softly. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my flashlight again and stepped outside. The air was colder than usual, damp and still. Every step I took made the gravel crunch under my boots. When I reached the field, I saw the barn door swaying slightly again. I called out for Eli, but there was no response, just the faint rustle of hay from inside. I hesitated at the doorway. My hands were shaking so badly the light bounced across the walls. I forced myself in. The smell hit me again, stronger this time. Wet soil, rust, and something else I couldn't name. The animals were restless in their pens, shifting and breathing fast, their eyes reflecting the light. Then I saw something at the far end of the barn, a shape hunched low behind a stack of hay. I took one slow step closer, then another. The beam of my flashlight slid over the floor, catching something dark that trailed toward the door, a streak of mud or maybe blood. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I whispered Eli's name again. The shape moved. Not much, just enough for me to see that it wasn't crouched. It was rising. Slowly. My flashlight trembled in my hand as the figure straightened. It was tall, taller than Eli, and its clothes hung loose, dirty and torn like they'd been soaked in mud. For a second, I thought it really was him. But then it turned toward me and the light hit its face. It wasn't a face at all, just a mess of dark, stretched skin, with no eyes where they should have been. The air seemed to tighten around me, thick and still. My chest felt like it was closing up. My heart beat so hard it hurt. I took one step back, then another. The thing tilted its head slightly, as if it was trying to understand me. Then it began to move, forward. It didn't run or crawl, it just walked. One slow, dragging step at a time. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't work. The smell grew stronger with every step it took, sharp and rotting. When it reached the edge of the light, it stopped. I could hear my own breathing, short and uneven. I forced myself to speak. My voice cracked as I said, "Eli?" It stayed still. For a moment, I thought maybe it was waiting for me to move first. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the darkness behind the hay. I ran. I don't even remember crossing the yard or getting into the house, only the sound of the door slamming shut, and my own pulse pounding in my ears. I locked every door and window I could find. The rest of the night, I sat in the kitchen with the lights on, listening to the creaking walls and the low hum of the windmill outside. Eli never came back. The sheriff found his boots near the barn the next morning, half buried in the mud. They searched the property for 3 days, but didn't find a trace of him. The official report said he must have wandered off during the night, maybe lost his way in the fields. I didn't argue, I just left. A few months later, I passed through that county again for work. Out of curiosity, or maybe guilt, I drove down the old dirt road toward the farm. It was abandoned now, overgrown with weeds, the barn door still hanging loose. I parked just long enough to look at the fields. That's when I saw it. A new scarecrow standing near the fence line, wearing Eli's flannel shirt. The same one he'd worn the night he vanished. Its head was wrapped in burlap, too smooth, too tight, and even from that distance, I could swear it was facing me. I didn't stay to make sure. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see that shape standing between the rows of corn, the way it swayed, the way it turned as if it knew my name. And no matter how much time passes, I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was didn't stay on that farm. It found me once before. I don't think it ever stopped watching. Story 4. It was supposed to be a simple favor. Just a few nights helping a friend watch over his family's old farm while they were out of town. I thought it would be peaceful, quiet, maybe even relaxing. But what happened there was nothing I could have prepared for. The farm sat on the edge of a long stretch of woods, miles away from the nearest neighbor. It wasn't fancy, just an aging house, a half-collapsed barn, and a few fenced pastures that hadn't seen animals in years. The place had that old smell of wood, hay, and dust that settles into your clothes after a few hours. My friend Mark told me to ignore the noises because the house creaked when the wind picked up. I laughed it off then. The first day passed easily. I explored the property, checked the doors and windows, and settled in for the night with a few beers. The sun went down fast, though, and when it did, the darkness outside felt heavy. There weren't any streetlights, just black fields and the faint outline of trees against the horizon. The house made a few noises as it cooled from the day's heat. Small groans, shifting wood, the distant sway of something metal outside. Around midnight, I heard what I thought was someone walking across the porch. Slow steps. Deliberate. Like boots dragging over the boards. I turned down the TV and listened, but the sound stopped. I went to the window and saw nothing but the faint glow of the porch light flickering. I tried to shake it off and went to bed, telling myself it was probably an animal or my imagination. The second night, the same thing happened, except this time, I could hear the floorboards in the hallway. They creaked one by one, moving toward the guest room where I was staying. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The sound stopped right outside my door. I didn't move for a long time. I remember how loud my heartbeat felt in my ears, how dry my throat was. I finally worked up the courage to whisper, "Mark." No answer. Just silence. After a few minutes, I heard the front door open and close. I ran out to the hall, but it was empty. The air felt colder somehow, like someone had just walked through. The next morning, I found footprints in the dust by the door, bare ones. The dirt around them looked fresh, like they'd been made that night. But what scared me most was that the prints didn't lead in from the outside. They led out. I tried to make sense of what I saw that morning, but there wasn't a logical explanation. The prints were too clear to be old, and the house had been locked from the inside all night. I checked every door and window. Nothing was broken, nothing forced. Still, the uneasiness wouldn't leave me. By evening, the house felt different. The air seemed heavier, the kind of stillness that presses on your skin. I told myself I was overreacting. I even left the lights on downstairs, trying to make the place feel less empty. But once the sun dipped below the trees, that feeling of being watched returned. I tried to distract myself, sitting by the window and scrolling through my phone, but I kept glancing outside toward the barn. The door was slightly open, swinging with the breeze. I remembered Mark mentioning not to go in there. It was unstable, he said. But that small gap in the door bothered me. I couldn't stop staring at it. Around midnight, I heard something outside again. Not footsteps this time. more like the faint shuffle of someone moving through dirt. I grabbed a flashlight and went out to check. The night was colder than before, and the air smelled faintly of rain and something else, like wet hay and rust. The flashlight beam shook in my hand as I walked across the yard. Every step felt louder than it should have been. When I reached the barn, the door was open wider than before, the hinge groaning softly. Inside, the light caught particles of dust floating in the air. Everything looked the same as earlier. Piles of hay, old tools, a few empty stalls. Then I noticed something near the back. There was a section of dirt that looked disturbed, freshly turned over, darker than the rest. Kneeling down, I brushed my hand across it and felt something solid beneath the surface. My stomach twisted. It felt like wood, long and flat, almost like the top of a box buried shallow. The flashlight dimmed for a moment. I turned it toward the stall beside me, and that's when I saw it, someone's coat hanging from the rafters. It was old, torn, covered in mud. I could have sworn it wasn't there before. Suddenly, the smell grew stronger. That metallic scent filled my nose, sharp and cold. I backed toward the door, my pulse pounding so hard I could barely breathe. As I stepped outside, I noticed something new in the dirt. A second set of footprints, leading away from the barn and heading straight toward the house. I froze, staring at those prints. They were clear, deep, and freshly made. The soil was still moist where the heels had pressed down. I followed them with my flashlight, the beam shaking with every heartbeat. They led all the way to the porch steps, then disappeared into the shadow beneath the door. I didn't want to go inside, but the thought of staying out in that open dark was worse. My hands were trembling as I turned the handle. The door creaked as it opened, and a gust of cold air hit me. The lights I'd left on earlier were still glowing dimly, but something felt wrong. The air inside the house smelled faintly of the same metallic scent I'd noticed in the barn. I called out for Mark, even though I knew he wasn't there. My voice cracked halfway through. The silence that followed was thick, almost humming in my ears. Then, from the hallway, I saw something on the floor. Muddy footprints, the same as the ones outside. They started at the front door and went down the hall toward the guest room. Each step I took felt heavier than the last. My breathing was fast and uneven, my chest tight. I wanted to turn around to run, but part of me had to see where those prints ended. The hallway stretched out in front of me, lit faintly by the lamp in the living room. The prints stopped right in front of my bedroom door. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to hear anything beyond the sound of my own breathing. Slowly, I reached for the door handle. The air on the other side felt colder, almost freezing. My hand hesitated. Then, in one quick motion, I pushed it open. The room was empty, completely still, but my blankets were pulled back. The sheets wrinkled like someone had been lying there, and on the pillow was a smear of dirt. My flashlight shook so badly I could hardly keep it steady. I stepped back into the hall, and that's when I saw movement in the reflection of the window beside me. There was someone standing just outside the glass, close, too close, a shape that didn't move. My chest locked up, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. When I forced myself to look directly, there was nothing there, only the empty yard. I packed my things that night and waited in my car until the sun came up. When Mark returned 2 days later, I didn't stay to explain. But before I left, I asked him one thing: if anyone had ever stayed there before me. He got quiet for a moment, then said, "Yeah, my uncle. He watched the place for me a few years back, but he disappeared one night. We never found out what happened." I didn't say anything. I just drove away. Still, sometimes when I'm trying to sleep, I swear I hear those floorboards again. Slow, steady steps moving down a hallway that isn't mine. And even though I moved miles away from that farm, I always make sure to lock my doors before dark, because I never figured out what came into that house, or if it ever really left. Story 5. I was staying at my uncle's farm for the summer, a stretch of land so far from town that you could drive 20 minutes and still see nothing but wheat and silence. He was getting older and needed help maintaining the place, feeding the animals, fixing fences, keeping the lights working in the barn. I thought it would be peaceful. I was wrong. The first few nights were calm, though the quiet felt heavier than I expected. At night, the sky was so dark it seemed to swallow everything. The only sounds were the wind brushing through the fields and the occasional groan of the barn doors shifting in their hinges. But even in that silence, I sometimes felt like something was awake out there, something that watched from beyond the crops. On the fourth night, I couldn't sleep. The house was old and full of soft creaks that came and went like breathing. I tried to ignore it, but then I noticed something different. Every few minutes, the faint sound of footsteps drifted in from outside, slow, steady, like boots sinking slightly into soil. I told myself it was probably the cows or maybe the wind pushing the barn doors, but the rhythm was too deliberate. I went to the window and looked toward the barn. The motion sensor light above the door flickered on for a moment, revealing nothing but the silver reflection of the tractor and the rows of tools leaning against the wall. Then it went dark again. I stared for a while, expecting to see someone walk out. Nothing moved. When I finally turned away, I caught a faint sound again, this time closer, maybe just outside the porch. My heart started pounding so loud I could feel it in my throat. I grabbed the flashlight by the door, forced a deep breath, and stepped outside. The air was cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and hay. The light beam cut through the dark, shaking slightly in my hand. The porch was empty. I swept the flashlight across the yard, the truck, the chicken coop, the path to the barn. Nothing. I was about to go back in when I saw something strange. The barn door was slightly open. I was sure I'd latched it earlier that evening. I hesitated. The distance between the house and barn wasn't far, maybe 100 feet, but it felt longer with the dark pressing around me. Every instinct told me to wait until morning, but curiosity got the better of me. I started walking toward the barn, my boots crunching softly on the dirt path. Halfway there, the light in my hand flickered and dimmed, just for a second. When it came back, I thought I saw movement near the open door, something low to the ground, retreating inside. My chest tightened, but I kept going. When I reached the barn, I pushed the door open and shone the flashlight inside. The smell hit me first, musty hay, old oil, and something else, sharp and metallic. The animals were quiet. Too quiet. I couldn't even hear them breathing. Then I noticed the ground near the stalls. The dirt looked disturbed, like something had been dragged through it recently. A long, uneven line led from the door deeper into the shadows between the stalls. I followed it, the light trembling as I moved. That's when I saw the feed bags piled against the far wall had been torn open. Not cut, but shredded, like by claws or something heavy scraping through them. And in the center of the mess, pressed into the hay, was the shape of a handprint. Not human-sized. Bigger. Wider. The fingers were deep enough to leave impressions in the packed dirt. My breath came out, uneven. I stepped back, trying to convince myself I was seeing it wrong, that it was just shadows. But the more I looked, the clearer it became. That was when I heard a sound behind me. Not a step, more like a slow shift of weight, something settling just out of view. My skin went cold. I turned slowly, my flashlight cutting across the barn in trembling circles. Dust floated in the beam like snow, but there was nothing there. Just the empty stalls, the old tractor under its tarp, and the silent animals staring back at me. Their eyes reflected the light in dull, glassy flashes. None of them moved, not even the horses, who usually shifted when anyone came close. The air felt heavier, thicker. My throat went dry, and every breath sounded too loud. I tried to speak, to call out for my uncle, but my voice caught halfway, coming out as a rasp. I took another step backward and almost tripped over a feed bucket. When I steadied myself, I noticed something new. Fresh prints in the dirt leading away from the wall where the handprint was. They weren't boot marks. They were long, stretched, uneven, almost like something had walked on both hands and feet. That was enough for me. I started backing toward the door, keeping the light fixed on those tracks. But as I reached the threshold, the flashlight flickered again, this time weaker. For one heartbeat, the entire barn fell into darkness. When the light came back, the handprint in the dirt was gone, smoothed over like the floor had never been disturbed at all. I didn't stay to check. I sprinted back to the house, slamming the door and locking it behind me. My uncle's shotgun hung by the entryway, so I grabbed it without thinking, loaded it, and waited by the window. The night outside was silent again. No movement, no light from the barn. It took me hours to calm down enough to move. My uncle was asleep in the next room, and I didn't want to wake him until sunrise. But around 3 a.m, I started hearing the animals again, low, uneven sounds, not quite panicked, but restless. I told myself it was normal. Just them settling after a long night. Still, I couldn't shake the image of that handprint, the depth of it, the shape. When morning came, I forced myself to go out there again. The sunlight made the barn look harmless, almost peaceful. My uncle followed, skeptical but concerned when he saw how pale I was. I showed him where I'd seen the prints, where the bags had been torn. He frowned, crouched down and brushed his hand over the dirt. "Coyotes," he said. "They get bold sometimes." I wanted to believe that. I really did. But coyotes don't make handprints, and they sure don't drag feed bags open with precision. I said nothing, just nodded, pretending to agree. The next few days passed quietly. I tried to keep busy, fixing fences, mending gates. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching. The animals stayed uneasy, avoiding one corner of the field near the old silo. Even in daylight, they wouldn't go near it. That night, I stayed up late reading in the living room. My uncle had gone to bed early, and the house felt hollow without the usual creaks and hums. Around midnight, the power flickered for a second. I glanced toward the window and froze. The barn light was on. I stared at it, waiting for it to shut off again like before. But it didn't. It stayed on, steady and pale. My first thought was that my uncle had gone out there, but when I went to check, his bedroom door was still shut. I don't know what made me do it, maybe curiosity, maybe stupidity, but I took the flashlight again and stepped outside. The air was colder than usual, carrying that same metallic scent I remembered. My boots sank slightly into the soft dirt as I crossed the yard. When I reached the barn, the door was wide open. The light inside buzzed faintly, swinging a little on its cord. And then I noticed something new on the wall, right beside the stalls. Long scratches, deep and clean, running parallel from floor to ceiling, as if something had been marking the wood deliberately. That's when I realized the smell in the air wasn't just oil or hay. It was blood. The smell grew stronger the closer I stepped inside. It was old and sour, clinging to the back of my throat. The animals were still in their stalls, but they were all facing the same direction, toward the far end of the barn, where the light didn't quite reach. Their breathing came in short, sharp bursts, like they were trying not to make noise. I lifted the flashlight and aimed it toward the dark corner. Something was there, a shape, hunched low, half hidden behind the bales of hay. For a moment, I thought it was a person, someone squatting, their back turned. My voice caught in my chest. "Who's there?" I managed, though it came out softer than I intended. The shape didn't move. I took a slow step forward, keeping the gun raised. My heart was pounding so hard that it hurt. I tried to steady the light, but my hand was trembling. The beam finally caught part of the figure, and I saw what looked like skin, stretched tight, gray and rough like dried mud, a shoulder, an arm. But the proportions were wrong. Too long, too lean. Then it shifted almost lazily, as if it had been waiting for me to get close enough. I froze. The air felt colder all at once. I wanted to run, but my body refused to move. It turned its head toward me, and I swear for a split second I saw a face, or something pretending to have one. Hollow eyes, a mouth that wasn't shaped right, and then it was gone. Not with sound or movement, just gone. One blink and the space was empty. The hay was undisturbed, the corner bare. My flashlight flickered, and I realized I was holding my breath. I backed away, step by step, keeping the gun aimed at that dark spot until I reached the doorway. When I finally made it outside, I ran straight to the house and locked the door behind me. My uncle woke up when he heard me stumble in. I told him what I saw. He didn't laugh, but he didn't believe me either. "You've been working too hard," he said. "That old place plays tricks at night." He went out the next morning to prove nothing was there. When he came back, he was pale. Said the scratches on the wall were gone. Said the animals wouldn't even let him near the stalls. I left the farm that afternoon. Haven't been back since. A few months later, my uncle called me. He sounded tired. Said something had been getting into the barn again. Animals missing, lights flickering every night around the same time. I told him to sell the place, to leave. He said he couldn't. Said whatever it was belonged there. That was the last time we spoke. The farm still stands. A neighbor told me it's been abandoned for years now. The animals are gone, the fields overgrown, and the barn light still comes on sometimes after midnight. Always for just a few minutes. Always the same pale glow. I think about it sometimes when I can't sleep. The sound of my boots crunching on dirt. The silence between breaths and that face turning toward me in the dark. And every time I do, I swear I can still smell that same faint trace of blood and earth, like it followed me home and never really left. Story 6. This happened 2 summers ago, and I still can't decide whether I actually saw what I think I saw, or if my mind just broke a little that night. My cousin Evan had asked me to help look after his family's farm while they were out of town. It was a quiet place on the edge of a valley, surrounded by cornfields that stretched so far they seemed to fade into the sky. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked when I first got there. But that feeling didn't last. The days were fine. Mornings started early, with the smell of hay and the low hum of insects waking up under the heat. But once the sun dropped, everything changed. The air felt heavier, thicker. Even the wind seemed different, slower, like it didn't want to move through that place after dark. On my second night, I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I thought I heard something move outside the window, just a shift in the grass at first. Then, faintly, what sounded like slow steps circling the house. I told myself it was probably a stray animal. But when I sat up and looked outside, the motion sensor light flickered on, and the field beyond the barn swayed as if someone had just stepped into it. I waited for a while, staring at the rows of corn bending in uneven waves, one section moving while the rest stood perfectly still. I should have gone back to bed, but something about the way the stalks kept parting, slowly, deliberately, made my chest tighten. I grabbed my flashlight and went downstairs. The house groaned as I moved. Old wood always does that, but that night, every sound seemed to echo louder. When I stepped onto the porch, the smell of soil hit me, mixed with the faint scent of something metallic. I called out once, my voice breaking the stillness. Nothing. No animals. No wind. Just quiet. I swept the flashlight toward the barn. The doors were closed, but the light inside was on. I hadn't turned it on that day. I could see dust floating through the yellow glow behind the slats, drifting like smoke. I took a step toward it, then another. The dirt path crunched beneath my boots, and for some reason I started to notice my own breathing. Too shallow, too fast. The barn stood about 50 feet from the house, but every step felt longer. When I finally reached it, I pressed my ear to the door. Nothing. Just silence and the faint hum of electricity from the light above. I pulled the latch and pushed the door open. Inside, everything was still. Too still. The tools were where I left them, the bales of hay untouched. But the air smelled wrong, like wet metal and old decay. I took a few cautious steps inside, scanning the corners with the flashlight. That's when I noticed it. Tracks in the dirt. Not boot prints. Not animal tracks either. Just deep impressions, spaced unevenly, as if something had crawled through instead of walked. They led from the back of the barn straight toward the center, stopping right at one of the empty stalls. The hay there looked flattened, disturbed, and underneath it, I swear I saw something glisten faintly in the light. I bent down slowly. The smell got stronger. My hand shook as I pulled the hay aside and saw what looked like the torn edge of fabric buried in the dirt. My first thought was that it might have been part of a feed sack, but when I pulled it up, I realized it wasn't that. It was denim, a pant leg, and still inside it was a boot. That's when the light above me flickered. The light blinked once, then steadied, casting long shadows across the barn walls. My stomach turned cold. I dropped the boot and stumbled backward, brushing dirt from my hands that suddenly felt clammy. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just stood there staring at that half-buried leg, trying to convince myself it was a mannequin. Some leftover scarecrow part my cousin forgot to mention. But the denim was real. The boot was real. I forced myself to breathe, to look again. When I crouched down, the air around me felt heavier, like the walls were pressing closer. I could see a few inches of fabric disappearing into the dirt. I grabbed the shovel leaning against the wall and started to dig, my hands trembling so hard the handle rattled. After 2 or 3 scoops, I saw more fabric than skin. Pale, dry, half-covered in soil. I dropped the shovel. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. The barn was so quiet that the sound of my own breathing filled the space. I took a step back, then another, until my shoulder hit the doorframe. I didn't remember closing the door, but somehow it was shut now. The only light came from the flickering bulb overhead, swinging just enough to make the shadows stretch and shrink like something moving in rhythm with it. I turned and pulled the door open. The hinges groaned in protest. I didn't even look back as I ran toward the house. My boots dug into the dirt, my chest tightening with every breath. I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and stood there, trying to slow down my breathing. I wanted to call the police, but my phone had no signal. It always lost reception out here, and the landline was in the kitchen, right beside the window facing the barn. I forced myself to go there anyway. The window glass reflected my face, pale and sweaty, but behind me, in the distance, I could still see that yellow light burning inside the barn. I picked up the phone. The dial tone was faint, but it worked. I started to punch in 911 when the light in the barn went out. Completely. I froze, the receiver still in my hand. For a few seconds, I stared at the dark outline of the barn. Then something shifted in the field behind it. The corn swayed, not in the direction of the wind, but against it, like something was moving through it toward the house. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The way the silence grew thicker, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I hung up the phone and stepped back from the window. My pulse pounded in my ears. I backed into the hallway, grabbed the shotgun my cousin kept above the coat rack, and loaded it, even though my hands shook so badly I almost dropped the shells. I didn't hear anything else for what felt like hours. The fields went still again, the night heavy and long. At some point, I must have dozed off in the chair by the front door because I woke up to sunlight bleeding through the curtains. The silence had changed. It wasn't tense anymore, just hollow. I checked the barn through the window. The door was open again, swinging gently in the wind. I forced myself to go outside, gripping the shotgun like it would somehow keep me safe. The air smelled cleaner now. The metallic scent gone. But when I reached the barn, the shovel I'd dropped was gone. So was the leg. The dirt was freshly smoothed over, no sign of anything buried. When I told my cousin what happened, he just frowned. Said the last farmhand quit without notice months ago. Said they never found him. That night, before I packed up to leave, I looked out the window one last time. The field was still, golden under the setting sun. But in one far corner, the corn seemed just a little taller, like something was standing beneath it, waiting for dark. I left the next morning before sunrise. I told Evan I had an emergency back home and couldn't stay the rest of the week. He didn't argue, just looked tired, like he'd been expecting me to say it. As I drove away, I caught one last glimpse of the barn in the rearview mirror. The door was closed again, and the light above it glowed faintly, even though the power should have been off. For weeks after I got home, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that piece of denim half buried in the dirt, the pale skin underneath, and the way the cornfield had seemed to breathe. I tried to tell myself it was exhaustion, that I'd imagined half of it. But sometimes, late at night, I'd wake up with the smell of soil in my nose, sharp and real, as if the air from that barn had followed me. A month later, Evan called. His voice sounded strained, quieter than usual. He said one of the cows had gone missing, then a second one 2 nights later. No tracks, he told me. No blood, no signs of a fence break. They're just gone. I told him to call animal control, maybe even the sheriff. But he just sighed and said they wouldn't come out that far anymore. Apparently, they'd already been there once. He mentioned something else before hanging up. He said he'd started finding dirt inside the house, small piles of it near the back door and under the windows. He thought it was being tracked in by the wind, but the way he said it, hesitant, unsure, made me think he didn't believe that himself. A week after that, I tried to call him again. No answer. I left a few messages, but he never called back. Eventually, I convinced myself he just wanted to be left alone. But then last winter, I saw a story online about a fire out near the valley. An old farmhouse burned down to the foundation. They said it was empty. No one had lived there in months. The article had one photo attached, a wide shot of the property taken from the road. Most of it was just ash and snow, but if you zoomed in just past the blackened shape of the barn, you could still make out part of the field behind it. And right in the middle of that dead gray land was a single patch of corn, green, standing tall, completely untouched by fire. I stared at that image for a long time. There was something about that patch that looked wrong. The rows didn't line up with the rest of the field. They curved inward, like they were growing around something. That night, I dreamed I was back there. The air was heavy and still, and the corn rose high on both sides of me. I couldn't see where I was walking, but I could feel the ground beneath my feet, soft, uneven, as if something was moving under it. When I looked down, I saw the dirt shifting, rising slightly, and for a brief second, a bit of denim pushed through the surface before being pulled back under. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart racing so hard it hurt. I turned on every light in the house, but the shadows still felt too deep, the silence too thick. It's been 2 years now. I haven't gone back, haven't talked to anyone from that part of the valley, but sometimes when I drive past open farmland, I catch myself scanning the fields for that same pattern. The rows bending wrong, the soil looking freshly turned, like something is still beneath it. And every time I see it, even from miles away, that same smell returns. That faint metallic scent that reminds me the farm isn't finished with me yet. Story 7. This happened about 6 years ago, and I still don't have an explanation for any of it. I just lost my job at the time and needed a place to stay, so my uncle offered me his old farmhouse out in the country. It had been empty for a while since he'd moved closer to town, but it was still in decent shape. At least that's what he told me. The rent was cheap, and I figured a few months of quiet would help me clear my head. The house sat on about 50 acres of land surrounded by wheat fields and a tree line that stretched out like a wall of shadows at the far end of the property. There was a small barn behind the house and a rusted windmill that creaked whenever the wind picked up. The first day there was fine, peaceful even. The air smelled clean, the silence was comforting, and at night the stars looked close enough to touch. But that silence changed after the first few nights. It wasn't the usual kind of quiet you get in the countryside. It felt heavier, like the air was listening. Sometimes I'd be sitting at the kitchen table and realize I hadn't heard a single bird or insect for hours. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and my own breathing. The first strange thing happened on my 3rd night there. I woke up around 2 in the morning because I thought I heard someone walking through the hallway. Slow, steady steps that stopped right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, waiting to hear a voice, but nothing came. After a while, I convinced myself it was just the house settling and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I found small bits of dirt on the wooden floor just outside my door. The prints were faint, too wide to be from an animal and spaced far apart, like someone had been dragging their feet. I cleaned it up and didn't tell anyone. A few days later, I was out by the barn fixing a loose door hinge when I noticed something strange in the field near the tree line. The wheat there was flattened in a perfect circle, like someone had pressed it down from above. I thought maybe it was just wind or an animal, but when I walked out to check, the air around it felt different. Still, cold. I don't know how else to describe it. Even the sound of the wind faded when I stepped inside that circle. That night, I sat on the porch watching the field. The circle was just visible under the moonlight, a darker patch against the pale gold of the wheat. Around midnight, I saw movement. Just a slight ripple through the crops, as if something was gliding between the rows. I tried to tell myself it was the wind again, but it wasn't. The rest of the field stayed perfectly still. I didn't sleep much after that. Every sound in the house started to feel too close. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, the old pipes moaning softly in the walls. Sometimes I'd catch what sounded like breathing in the next room, slow and steady, like someone standing just behind the doorway. A week later, I found the dirt again. This time, not in the hallway, but near the front door. And beside it, Half buried in the dust was a single wheat stalk, bent, broken, and damp as if it had just been pulled from the field. That was when I started sleeping with the lights on. The nights got worse after that. I'd lie in bed listening to the faint creaks of the old farmhouse, trying to tell myself they were normal, that the house was just shifting with the wind. But then there were moments when the air would go still, completely still, and I'd hear something else. Not footsteps exactly, but a kind of dragging sound, soft and uneven, moving from the hallway toward the kitchen. I stopped looking when I heard it. It was easier to pretend it wasn't real if I didn't see anything. I'd just pull the blanket tighter and wait for it to fade. Most times it did, but one night it didn't. I'd left the kitchen light on before going to bed. Around midnight, I woke up again, heart pounding for no clear reason. The light from the kitchen was faint under my door, but there was a shadow cutting across it. Still, motionless. For a few seconds, I just stared. Then the light flickered once and steadied again, but the shadow was gone. I didn't move for almost an hour. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty. The smell of soil hung faintly in the air, damp and sour, like wet earth after rain. I walked slowly toward the kitchen, every board under my feet creaking in protest. The door to the back porch was open, not wide, just enough for the night air to seep through. I could see the fields stretching out beyond the barn, silver under the moonlight. The circle in the wheat was still there, but it wasn't empty anymore. There was something standing in the middle of it. It wasn't clear at first. Just a dark shape, too still to be a person, too tall to be an animal. I felt my chest tighten. I turned off the kitchen light, hoping to see it better in the dark. But when the house went black, the figure was gone. The field looked empty again. I told myself I'd imagined it. That exhaustion and loneliness were getting to me. The next day, I packed my things, ready to leave, but I never got the chance. My uncle called that afternoon to check in, and when I told him about the circle in the dirt, he went quiet for a long time. Then he asked, almost whispering, "You didn't go into the trees, did you?" I told him no. I hadn't even gone that far into the field. He told me to stay out of that part of the property and to keep the doors locked at night. When I asked why, he said something strange. Just because the land looks empty doesn't mean it is. Then he hung up. That evening, I sat on the porch until sunset. The field was calm again, the wheat swaying gently. For a while, I started to think I really had imagined everything. But as the light faded, I noticed something at the edge of the tree line. A second circle. This one was larger, darker, and inside it, faintly catching the last of the daylight, was what looked like a figure bent low, as if digging. I couldn't move. The longer I stared, the less sense it made. The figure in the field wasn't moving like a person. It shifted slowly, unsteady, almost dragging itself along the dirt. When I finally blinked, it was gone. The circle looked empty again, only darker than before, like the soil had been turned over. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep inside the house. I sat by the window with a flashlight in my hand, watching the field until my eyes burned. The windmill turned lazily in the distance, and the sound of the blades seemed to fade in and out, uneven, like something was moving between them. At some point, I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes again, it was still dark, but the flashlight was dead. The only light came from the barn, glowing faintly through the cracks in the wood. I knew I hadn't left it on. For a long moment, I just sat there, trying to convince myself to stay put, to wait for morning. But the glow from the barn didn't stop. And after a while, curiosity won. I stepped outside. The air was colder than usual, the kind of cold that bites through your clothes. The grass under my boots was damp, like it had just rained, though the sky was clear. When I reached the barn, the smell hit me first. Wet soil and something else beneath it, faintly metallic. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the light inside buzzed softly, hanging from a single cord. The space looked normal at first, tools lined on the walls, stacks of hay, the old tractor. But the ground was wrong. The dirt looked fresh, turned up, darker than it should have been, and right in the center, where the light hit hardest, was a hole. Shallow but wide, as if someone or something had been digging there recently. I took a step closer. My throat felt dry, and my heartbeat was so fast I could feel it shaking my chest. Then I noticed something half buried near the edge of the hole. A piece of fabric. Denim. Torn, muddy, stiff. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached down, pulled it up, and saw a familiar tear at the knee. It was my own jeans. The pair I'd thrown away in the trash behind the house 2 days earlier. I dropped the fabric and stumbled back, my pulse roaring in my ears. The barn light flickered once, dimmed, then steadied again. I turned toward the door and froze. There were footprints in the fresh soil, bare, deep, and wet. They started at the hole and led toward the exit, but they didn't stop there. They continued past me, out into the field. I ran. Straight to the house. I locked the door, shut every window, and sat in the kitchen until morning, gripping the flashlight even though it no longer worked. The fields outside stayed still the whole time, quiet and endless. When the sun finally rose, I went outside. The hole in the barn was gone. The floor was smooth again, like nothing had been dug there. But the second circle in the field had grown wider, and now there was another one forming beside it. I left that afternoon. I didn't tell my uncle what I saw. I didn't tell anyone. A few months later, I heard that the farmhouse burned down in the middle of the night. The cause was listed as electrical, but the fire department found no wiring where it started, just a patch of scorched soil near the tree line, perfectly round. Sometimes when I drive through the countryside and see fields stretching past the horizon, I get that same feeling again, the silence pressing in, the air too heavy. And I can almost smell the dirt from that barn, faint and cold, like it's waiting for me to come back. Story 8. I'll never forget that week on my uncle's farm. It was supposed to be a break from the city, quiet, simple, maybe even peaceful. But what I experienced there still follows me, especially when I hear the wind moving through open fields. It sounds the same. The farm sat miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by acres of dead corn that had never been harvested. My uncle used to say the soil stopped being right years ago, but he stayed because the land was his father's, and leaving it felt like betrayal. I arrived one evening, just before dusk. The sky was heavy and gray, the kind that makes you think a storm is waiting behind the clouds. The house looked tired, paint peeling, roof sagging, windows fogged from the inside. Still, it felt like home in a strange way. Uncle Ray didn't talk much that first night. He just gave me a quick tour, told me which boards not to step on, and pointed out the shed behind the barn. "Don't go near that after dark," he said flatly. I thought he was joking, but there wasn't a hint of humor in his eyes. First few days were uneventful. I helped feed the livestock, fixed a few fences, and spent the afternoons exploring the property. The air smelled like dirt and rust, and sometimes when the wind shifted, I swore I could smell something faintly sour, like meat gone bad. I told myself it was the compost pile. Still, I avoided looking in that direction. On the fourth night, I woke up feeling like someone was standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't see anyone, but I could sense a presence, heavy, watchful. The floor creaked once, softly, and then nothing. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to call out for my uncle, but the words stayed trapped in my throat. After a while, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Old wood moves, that's all. The next morning, I found Uncle Ray outside near the barn, staring at something in the dirt. There were footprints, bare, small, and scattered around like someone had been walking in circles all night. I laughed nervously and asked if maybe a neighbor had wandered over, but he just said, "We don't have neighbors this close." Then he asked if I'd been out. I shook my head. That evening, I noticed the barn door swinging open, though I knew I'd latched it earlier. When I went to close it, I caught a glimpse inside, hay scattered, tools overturned, and something else, a shape. At first I thought it was a pile of old feed sacks, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it looked like something curled up, almost like a person lying on their side. I froze. My chest tightened. When I blinked, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing faint movements from outside my window, slow, dragging steps that came and went in uneven rhythms. Each time I looked, there was nothing, just the same dead corn, waving gently under the moonlight. By morning, I decided I was leaving. But before I could pack, Uncle Ray told me he needed help in the shed. The same shed he told me to avoid. And that's when things started to feel wrong, really wrong. The shed stood behind the barn, half sunk into the ground, its roof bending inward like something heavy had sat on it for years. The closer we got, the colder the air felt, as if the sunlight just stopped reaching that part of the property. My uncle's boots crunched on the gravel while mine sank slightly into the damp soil. I didn't say anything, but my stomach was tight, uneasy. He didn't explain what he needed help with, just opened the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, metallic and sour, thick enough to taste. Inside there were tools on the walls, rusted saws, ropes, hooks, all coated with dust except for a few that looked recently used. The light from the doorway barely reached the corners. I couldn't shake the feeling that something in there was waiting for us to leave. Uncle Ray walked over to an old freezer in the corner. "It stopped working again," he muttered. "Help me move it." We pushed it away from the wall, and the sound it made against the concrete floor was rough and grating. Behind it was a patch of darker soil, uneven, like it had been dug up and filled again. He stared at it for a long time. I wanted to ask what was buried there, but something in his face told me not to. His hands were trembling slightly. That night, I lay awake listening for any sound from outside. The house felt different, tense, like it was listening too. I could hear my uncle pacing the hallway for hours, sometimes stopping right outside my door. I thought about asking him what was going on, but I was afraid he might tell me the truth. Around midnight, the animals started making noise in the barn. Low, restless movements that didn't stop. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the walls like a warning. I went to the window, and under the faint moonlight, I saw something, moving near the edge of the cornfield. It was hunched, swaying slightly, and it looked wrong. The shoulders were too narrow, the head tilted in a way that didn't seem possible. It disappeared between the rows without a sound. I wanted to wake my uncle, but when I stepped into the hallway, his room was empty. The sheets were thrown aside and the back door was open. The wind pushed it gently, making it creak. Outside, the yard was covered in fog. I called his name quietly, but there was no answer. Just that thick silence that made every breath feel louder than it should. I found him near the barn, standing perfectly still, facing the fields. His body looked tense, as if he was holding his breath. When I reached him, I saw what he was staring at. Footprints again, the same small ones as before, circling the barn. But this time, they didn't stop. They led into the corn. He turned to me and whispered, almost to himself, "It's back." His eyes were glassy, distant. I buried it, but it came back. He started walking toward the field, and even though every part of me screamed not to follow, I couldn't let him go alone. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the scent of wet earth and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. The corn rustled even though there was no wind. When we reached the middle of the field, the ground felt soft, like it was hollow beneath us. My uncle stopped and knelt down. "This is where I found her," he said quietly. "After the storm last year." I didn't get the chance to ask who he meant, because that's when I realized we weren't alone. At first I thought it was the fog shifting, but then I saw it, something standing just beyond the rows. Its outline was faint, blurred by the mist, but its shape was human enough to make my chest tighten. My uncle froze. His breath came out sharp and uneven. The figure didn't move toward us. It only stood there, swaying slightly, head tilted in that same unnatural angle I'd seen before. I could feel its eyes on us, even though I couldn't make out a face. My legs felt weak, and the back of my neck burned as if someone was standing directly behind me. Uncle Ray whispered, "Go back to the house." I didn't move, neither did he. The air between us and that thing felt alive, like it was breathing with us. Then it turned, slowly, and disappeared into the fog. My uncle chased after it before I could stop him. I called out his name, but he vanished between the stalks. The sound of the corn shifting faded until there was nothing but silence. I waited. 5 minutes, maybe 10. The fog thickened until I couldn't see my own hands. I tried to follow where he went, but every direction looked the same. My heart was hammering, my breath short and sharp. Then I saw it again. Those footprints. Small, bare, pressed deep into the soil, leading back toward the shed. When I finally reached the shed door, it was open. Inside, the air felt colder than before. I saw the freezer still pulled away from the wall, and in front of it, my uncle's boots. Empty. Just the boots, tipped slightly toward each other as if he had been standing there moments ago. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't listen. Something was breathing inside that shed, slow and deep. I could hear it even though the room was still. My pulse was racing so fast I thought I might faint. I backed out slowly, not taking my eyes off that dark space near the freezer. When I finally got the courage to turn and run, the fog had lifted a little. The barn, the fields, the house, they all looked unchanged, like nothing had happened. But when I reached the porch, I realized the front door was open too. Inside, the hallway light was flickering. There were footprints, muddy ones, leading from the back door to my room. Smaller than mine, bare. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on the porch until the sun rose, staring at the empty fields. My uncle never came back. The sheriff's department searched for days, but found nothing. They said maybe he wandered off, maybe he got lost in the fog, but they didn't see the footprints. They didn't smell the air inside that shed. I left the next morning and never returned. Sometimes, though, when the night is quiet enough, I can almost hear that same slow breathing again. Soft, steady, like something just outside the window waiting to be remembered. And every time I close my eyes, I see those footprints, leading back toward the corn, disappearing into the earth that never truly sleeps. Story 9. This happened 3 summers ago, and I still can't tell you what I saw, or what I think I saw, on my family's old farm. It was the last time I ever set foot on that land. My father had passed the year before, leaving me the property, 50 acres of worn-out soil, 1 leaning barn, and a house that hadn't felt like home in years. I'd grown up there, but it always carried this quiet weight to it. When I went back, I told myself it was just for a few days, to clean up, to prepare the place for sale. But part of me wanted to face whatever it was that made me uneasy as a kid. The first day went as expected. Dusty rooms, broken furniture, walls stained from decades of humidity. The place smelled of hay and something else underneath it. Something faintly metallic like old blood. I spent hours sweeping, patching up window frames, trying to ignore how empty it all felt. By sunset, the cicadas were screaming, and I could barely hear myself think. The nights were worse. The silence out there wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, pressing in from every direction. Lying in that old bed, I could hear the floor settling, the wind scraping against the walls, the faint shifting of the barn doors outside. Every time I started to drift off, something small would bring me back, a soft step, the faint rasp of breathing that didn't belong to me. On the second morning, I found the front door open. I was sure I'd locked it the night before. Nothing looked stolen, but there were small clumps of soil on the floor, like someone had walked in from the fields. I checked around, even went out to the porch, scanning the tall grass, but saw nothing except rows of corn swaying gently. That afternoon, I drove into town to get supplies. At the hardware store, an older man behind the counter asked if I was staying out there alone. When I said yes, he just frowned and muttered, "Not much grows on that land anymore." I wanted to ask what he meant, but he changed the subject. That evening, the light faded faster than usual. By the time I got back, the sky was already dim, the barn barely visible against the horizon. I left my truck headlights on while unloading the tools, and that's when I noticed it. Someone standing near the edge of the cornfield. I froze. It wasn't close. Maybe 50 feet away, just beyond where the light reached. But I could see enough. A shape, tall, motionless, facing my direction. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. I told myself it was a scarecrow. That's what it had to be. But when I went to check the next morning, there was nothing there. No scarecrow, no footprints, just soil, loose and dark, like something had been unearthed. That's when the unease began to turn into fear. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching the house. Every creak in the wood, every shift in the wind felt deliberate. I sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp on, listening to the old walls breathe. The silence between sounds made my skin crawl. I decided to check the barn before trying to sleep. My father always said animals sensed things before people did, and though there hadn't been livestock there in years, I still half expected to hear movement inside. The air grew colder the closer I got, and the smell, rot and rust, hit me before I reached the doors. Inside, everything was the same as I remembered. Hay scattered, the tractor under a torn tarp, tools hanging along the wall. But something about it felt wrong. I noticed one of the hooks swaying slightly, even though there wasn't any wind. The chain beside it trembled like it had just been touched. I called out, hello?" My voice didn't echo. It just disappeared into the air. When I turned to leave, I saw footprints in the dirt near the entrance. Bare footprints. Small. They led from the open barn door to the back wall, then stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had vanished halfway through a step. I went back inside the house and locked every door and window. My hands were shaking. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I just sat in bed, watching the thin curtain shift from the slightest breeze. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under, but I woke again just before dawn. The air in the room felt stale, heavy, almost damp. I heard something faint from the field, like rustling. I looked out the window. The corn was moving, but not from wind. It moved in waves as if something was passing through it slowly, pushing the stalks aside. The motion stopped halfway across the field, and then the rows went still. By morning, I was convinced I was imagining things. Isolation, lack of sleep, it all played tricks on the mind. That's what I kept telling myself while I made coffee and packed my tools. But then I saw them. Prints again, outside the porch this time, leading away from the house toward the field. Bare feet, small ones, deep enough that the soil had filled with dew. I followed them for a few yards before stopping. The prints didn't just end this time. They sank, as if whoever it was had stepped down to the ground. I couldn't explain it. I just knew I didn't want to be there anymore. I went back to the house to grab my keys and found the front door open. Again. The air inside was colder than it should have been. My father's old chair in the living room was facing the window now. I was sure I'd left it turned the other way. That's when I started hearing something I couldn't reason away. Slow, steady breathing. But it wasn't coming from me. The breathing came from the hallway. Slow, drawn out, almost calm, like someone standing just beyond sight. I stood frozen, my pulse thudding in my throat. Every sound in the house seemed sharper now. The groan of the wood beneath my feet, the faint hum of the lamp, the shallow rhythm of my own breath trying to match the other one. I whispered my father's name, even though I knew that wasn't who it was. There was no reply, just the air shifting slightly, carrying that faint smell of soil and decay. My hands were sweating. I took one step toward the hall, each movement painfully careful, and the breathing stopped. The silence that followed felt wrong, too sudden, too complete. I waited there for what felt like minutes, staring into the darkness of the hallway, until I finally forced myself to move. I grabbed my bag and headed for the truck outside, not daring to look back. The morning light was dull, washed out gray, the kind that makes everything look lifeless. But as I opened the door to leave, I saw something in the distance, near the edge of the field. A figure, small, still facing me. It stood exactly where the footprints had disappeared the day before. I could barely make out details, just the shape of it, but it looked like a child, standing ankle-deep in the soil. I called out, my voice breaking halfway through. The figure didn't move. The corn around it began to sway again, though the air was still. My chest tightened. I took a step backward toward the truck, never looking away, and then, without warning, the figure sank, slowly, straight down, swallowed by the earth as if the ground opened beneath it. I ran. I drove without stopping until the farmhouse was just a shadow behind me. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I kept checking the rearview mirror even though there was nothing there but road and dust. When I reached town, I went straight to the local sheriff. They sent a deputy to check the property, but they said there was nothing unusual. No footprints, no figure, not even the marks in the soil I'd seen. The deputy told me the ground looked untouched, as if no one had been there for weeks. I didn't argue. I didn't go back either. A month later, I got a call from a neighbor. Someone had bought the property. A family. They had a young daughter. He said she liked playing out in the fields. Said she'd even built a small scarecrow near the edge of the corn. I hung up before he could finish. I knew exactly where she had placed it. And sometimes, when I can't sleep, I imagine her out there, standing in that same gray light, hearing slow breathing behind her, just like I did. And maybe this time, whatever lives under that soil won't stop it watching. Story 10. This happened 2 years ago, and even now I can't drive past an open field without feeling sick. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a quiet weekend on my cousin's farm. Some time away from the noise of the city, a bit of work, a bit of rest. But what happened there still doesn't make sense, and I don't think it ever will. The farm was in the middle of nowhere, 30 minutes from the nearest town, surrounded by fields that stretched farther than I could see. When I first arrived, I noticed how still everything felt. The air was thick, unmoving, and there weren't any birds. You don't realize how wrong that is until you stand in it. No chirping, no rustling, nothing. Just quiet. My cousin, Daniel, met me at the gate. He looked tired, skin pale, eyes ringed like he hadn't slept in weeks. He told me the animals had been acting strange, refusing to go near the southern field. Probably coyotes, he said, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than me. The first night, I stayed in the guest room upstairs. The farmhouse was old. Every step and floorboard seemed to sigh under my weight. I could hear the wind pressing against the windows, the low groan of the barn doors shifting. It wasn't loud, but enough to keep me awake. Sometime past midnight, I heard footsteps outside, slow, dragging through the gravel near the porch. My chest tightened. But I told myself it was Daniel checking the animals. When I looked through the window, I didn't see him. Instead, I saw the outline of someone or something standing near the edge of the field. It wasn't moving, just standing there, a dark figure against the lighter grass. I blinked, and it was gone. By morning, I was almost sure I'd imagined it. Sleep deprivation can make you see things. That's what I told myself as I drank my coffee and avoided mentioning it to Daniel. But he brought it up first. He asked if I'd seen anyone near the field the night before. My stomach dropped. I said no, but the way he looked at me told me he didn't believe me. Later that day, he asked me to help fix a fence near the barn. The posts had been bent inward, not broken from age or weather, pushed. I didn't ask what could have done that. As the sun went down, Daniel told me not to go outside after dark. His tone wasn't joking. He just said, "If you hear anything, stay inside." I didn't argue. But that night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Something that sounded like breathing, coming from just outside my door. I held my breath and listened. The sound was faint but steady, slow, controlled, like whoever was out there was trying not to be heard. I could almost feel the air shift under the door with each exhale. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and I could barely think straight. After a while, the breathing stopped. I waited another few minutes before moving, then turned on the small lamp by the bed. The light flickered once and steadied, casting long shadows across the room. I stared at the door, half expecting it to open, but it didn't. The next morning, I found Daniel outside by the barn, his expression pale and distant. He said one of the goats had gone missing. No blood, no tracks, just gone. I asked if he thought it was a wild animal, but he didn't answer. He just looked toward the southern field again and said, "It's always that side." I walked out there alone later, even though I didn't really want to. The grass was taller on that end, brittle and dry, even though the rest of the field was green. The soil beneath my boots felt uneven, like the ground had been disturbed. When I crouched down, I noticed something half buried in the dirt, an old rope, frayed and torn. It looked like it had been cut loose. That night, I couldn't relax. Every noise felt wrong, the wind, the creaking of the old rafters, even the way the floor seemed to breathe under my feet. Daniel stayed in his room, door shut, lights off. I kept my lamp on and sat by the window, staring out toward the fields. Sometime after midnight, I saw movement again. Someone was out there, standing between the rows of corn. This time, I could see a little clearer. tall, thin, shoulders hunched forward. It wasn't Daniel. I knew that right away. The thing wasn't walking. It was swaying like it was trying to keep balance. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow. The longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't swaying. It was turning, slowly, as if it knew I was watching. Then, all at once, the light in my room flickered and went out. The darkness was absolute. I couldn't even see my own hands. I fumbled for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it at the window. The glass reflected my face for a second, but just behind my reflection, standing outside, was something else. A shape. Still. Watching. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, and the light slipped from my hand. When I picked it up again, the window was empty. By morning, Daniel was gone. His truck was still in the driveway, keys on the counter, boots by the door. I called his name over and over, checked the barn, the fields, even the old shed near the edge of the property. There was no sign of him. What I did find, though, was something that made my stomach twist. Near the southern field, the dirt had been disturbed again, freshly turned soil forming a shallow mound, like something had been buried or dug up during the night. I couldn't bring myself to get closer. The air felt heavy, thick with that strange metallic scent I'd noticed before. It was strongest near that spot, enough to sting the back of my throat. I turned away and ran back to the house. The phone inside had no signal, even though it had worked the day before. Every creak in the floorboards made my heart jump. I tried to tell myself Daniel had gone into town, but deep down I knew he hadn't. His wallet was still on the kitchen counter. I stayed in the house until dark, too afraid to leave, too afraid to stay. The fields outside were still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving out there, low to the ground, just beneath the surface of the crops. Every time I looked through the window, I thought I saw the rows shifting, parting slightly, like something was crawling between them. As night settled in, I heard the floor groan upstairs. I froze. I had locked every door, every window. My breathing grew shallow, chest tight. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate step across the wooden floor above me. Then another. I stood in the living room, staring up at the ceiling. I couldn't move. My legs felt weak, my palms slick with sweat. I waited, barely breathing, as the steps moved from one end of the hallway to the other. Then they stopped right above where I was standing. The house went silent again, completely still. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have at some point. When I opened my eyes, the morning light was cutting through the curtains. Everything looked normal. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd dreamt all of it. But then I noticed something by the door, muddy prints, small, bare, leading from the hallway toward the porch. I followed them outside, each one pressed deep into the dirt, ending right at the edge of the southern field. There, standing among the tall grass, was a single wooden post I hadn't seen before. A scarecrow, new, crudely built, wearing Daniel's flannel shirt. I stared at it for a long time, my throat dry, my heart pounding. The breeze was barely moving, but the scarecrow's head shifted slightly, tilting toward me like it was trying to look back. I left that morning. I didn't take anything, didn't even lock the door. A few months later, I heard from someone in town that the farm was still empty, but they said there were new scarecrows now, 3 of them this time, all facing the house. And every so often, when I drive through that part of the countryside, I swear I can feel eyes watching from the fields, waiting for me to stop and look.